And welcome everyone to Backyard Beekeeping. I am Jennifer Fishburne, and I'm a horticulture educator covering Logan, Menard, and Sangamon counties. So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here again. So again, as I mentioned, today is backyard beekeeping that we're going to be discussing. Oops. So today we are talking about the honeybee. The honeybee, his scientific name is Apis mellifera. Apis meaning bee-like and mellifera meaning honey. Fits this honeybee quite well. The honeybee is native to Portugal and to Spain, and the particular honeybee we're talking about is the western honeybee. It actually is not native to the United States, and it was first noticed in the United States area in 1622 along what would be the coast of Virginia. And believe it or not, commercial scale beekeeping has been around since the ancient Roman times, so quite a long time. I couldn't begin today's presentation, though, without giving a nod to our native bees. There are more than 20,000 known species of native bees in the world, and in Illinois alone, there's 400 to 500 species of native bees. These bees can include bumblebees, carpenter bees, cellophane bees, squash bees, mason bees, leafcutter bees, sweat bees, yellow-faced bees, longhorn bees, and mining bees in Illinois. And I'll also mention here that if you are considering beekeeping because you're trying to save the bees, this probably isn't the hobby for you, but I would really encourage you, if that is what you want to do, to create habitats and floral resources in your own garden spaces or any public spaces that you might be involved with. Of the native bees that are in Illinois, 90% of those bees are considered to be solitary bees. So we see on the left picture here a bumblebee that is a ground nesting bee. And of our native bees, 70% of them are ground nesting. And what that means is what you see here. That's a bare, sunny spot of bare soil where a bee can tunnel their way into the ground and raise their young there. Also, the majority of the bees, as I mentioned, are solitary, unlike the honeybee, which is a social insect. Social meaning that they cooperatively participate in brood care, reproductive division of labor, and that they have overlapping generations. Of the remainder, the 30% of native bees in Illinois, those are ones that will use existing holes and hollow stems, dead wood, rock crevices for their nest sites. So it's important that we leave up hollow stems in our gardens so that they do have a place to nest. So this would mean if you had, for example, purple coneflower or black-eyed Susans, that you cut those flower stalks back to about 12 to 18 inches tall, and then that will leave easy access for the bees to get into that nesting habitat. So we can see this demonstrated in the right picture here. So that'll make it just a little bit easier for the bee to get in there. In addition, if you can leave piles of branches in your yard, in your landscape somewhere, or small piles of rock, that can also be beneficial. Wanted to mention 3 of our newer websites that we have from the University of Illinois Extension. The first one, we have a new Illinois native bee site. Along with that, on that page, you can find an Illinois native bee fact sheet, which will give you more information on the bees that I talked about. And then we also have an Illinois pollinators page as well that I would encourage you to visit. And on that, you'll find information about more types of pollinators. In addition, you'll find information on native plants. Also want to give a nod to the fact that there is some growing information on honeybees versus native pollinators. What I will mention about this is that honeybees are generalist pollinators, meaning they'll visit many types of flowers. And in this case makes them often inefficient pollinators for native plants. And whereas our native bees are many times specific to certain native plants. The other thing I would mention is that too many bee colonies in an area could have a negative impact on native bees. But having a few hives in a city or rural area, not in large numbers, may not be as disruptive. So more research is needed on that. So what does beekeeping look like in the United States? Honeybees help pollinate over 100 crops grown commercially in the United States. And these include, and not limited to, almonds, apples, blueberries, cranberries, cucumbers, squash, and watermelon. In the United States alone, bees help pollinate, their pollinating services help add value of $18 billion to crops in the United States. And of the 2.68 million colonies, I think that might have been, my number might be off slightly there in the United States. We need 2.7 million colonies to pollinate the California almond crops. And in Illinois, as of last year, there were 5,275 beekeepers in Illinois with 36,469 colonies. Of those, 89% are what we consider hobby beekeepers with less than 10 hives. And last year alone, there were 520 new beekeepers in Illinois. How do we know these numbers for Illinois? In Illinois, beekeepers are required to register with the Illinois Department of Agriculture that they are keeping bees and how many colonies that they have. The other note of interest here is that in Illinois, bees are considered livestock. So why might you want to keep bees, or why should you keep bees? Beekeeping is a hobby that a lot of people do find once they get past the fear of being stung, they find it to be and actually a hobby that relieves stress. They enjoy watching the hives and the bees in action. And many of our beekeepers do enjoy it, or they wouldn't do it, obviously. So if you have a few hours to spare each week, beekeeping might be a hobby for you. If you're looking to make a lot of money and you only have a few hives, you might find something else better to do with your time because you're not going to get rich quickly selling honey and bee products if you're doing it as a hobbyist. Obviously, commercial growers is a different story. Some beekeepers do rent their hives out for pollination services. As we mentioned earlier, that is a huge industry for the almond crop. So if you like the sweet taste of honey or honey products, which include comb honey, cut comb honey, chunk honey, creamed honey, beeswax, pollen, propolis, and a royal jelly, you might find that this is a rather fascinating hobby. So why might you not want to keep bees? The number one thing is if you are allergic to bees. So almost everyone that gets stung by a bee will have some swelling and itching in the area where the bee stung them. But if you have trouble breathing, that is not a normal reaction, and therefore you may not want to keep bees. It's also recommended that if you do become a beekeeper, you have a conversation with your doctor about getting an EpiPen. If you can't lift heavy objects, for example, a full medium honey super can weigh up to 40 pounds. So if that is a limiting factor for you, or you don't have someone to assist you, That might be another consideration of why not to keep bees. Most importantly, for many of us who live in urban areas, we need to check our local ordinances and with our municipalities to see if backyard beekeeping is allowed. As I mentioned before, if a community says that livestock is not allowed within the city limits, then you would not be able to keep bees as they're considered livestock in Illinois. Also, if beekeeping is permitted in your area, and you live in an urban area, make sure you talk to your neighbors in advance of starting to keep bees. The last thing you want is them to not be aware and that somebody might have a severe allergy to bees. So as I mentioned, the first thing with urban beekeeping is you do want to check with your local ordinances and make sure that is permitted. And if it is not permitted and that's something you really desire, you might consider joining a local beekeeping group and seeing if you can advocate for a change. If it is allowed, there may be property setbacks so far off the property line, so make sure you check in on that as well. The next step before you even consider purchasing bees or bee equipment is to talk to your neighbors. Inform them about bees, the value that they may have, what you're planning to do with them, offer them a bottle of honey, make sure that they don't think that that would be an issue for them. Also, if you keep them out of sight, out of mind, that's helpful as well. If you rent property, you'll need to make sure that you get your landowner's permission before you begin to keep bees. And lastly, only keep gentle bees. In an urban setting, we also need to think of a few other factors here, and that's that we don't want our bees to leave their hives and directly take off into the flight path of a neighbor's sidewalk or any other way that they might be flying directly into the path of humans or livestock or pets. So we want to create an obstacle for them, possibly maybe placing that hive so the entrance is not far from a fence or from a row of shrubs where they have to lift up their flight pattern and not be flying directly out of the hive, but rather up a little bit so that they're above the height of where humans might be walking or pets. The other thing is don't place them in the front yard. Try to keep them out of sight, out of mind of neighbors. That helps as well. And most importantly, provide a water source for your bees. This goes for urban and rural settings, but more particularly in urban settings. Make sure you provide the bees with a water source that's located nearby the hive. This will help prevent them from wanting to visit the neighbor's swimming pool. Although if they do visit your neighbor's swimming pool, that usually means that there's some type of a pH imbalance on their pool. Next, I would mention to do your homework. A lot of folks out there think that beekeeping is very simple, and it really isn't too difficult to get started. But understanding good practices to have good bee health is essential to having a colony over winter and keeping that colony from year to year. So it's important that you educate yourself, possibly with a beekeeping class, whether that be online or in person. You could join a beekeeping club. Many times the club members are very willing to share their knowledge with you, provided many times that you take a class in advance of asking a lot of questions. Purchase books about introduction to beekeeping and use internet resources. Try to stick with educational websites for your resources or state beekeeping association websites. And if you're looking for an online class and you can't find any in Illinois, Penn State offers an online Beekeeping 101 class that you might check into. Beekeeping is an investment of your time and money, so it's important that you start off on the right foot. The Illinois State Beekeepers Association is a great place to start to try to find classes that are coming up or their affiliated association clubs that you could join. Also on their website, you should find the list of the beekeeping classes. Many of those are offered in the January through March timeframe, so you may still find a few of those out there as well. So again, plan, plan, plan. I can't repeat that enough. Educate yourself before you begin. So where should a hive be located? A hive should be located where you have full sun, food resources available, and water source nearby. You're not only looking for just flowering plants, but you're looking for plants that you would be flowering and available food from spring to late fall. And you want plants to provide both nectar and pollen. And those sometimes could be the same plant and sometimes a different plant. These don't have to be plants that are located in your backyard, but maybe within your block or a short area distance around your home. However, bees will fly up to 2 miles to find a good food source, and they have been known to fly up to 5 miles. But it's preferred that they take shorter trips, as each time they fly, they do wear their wings out, so they won't live as long if they have to fly further to find food resources or water resources. If possible, always purchase new equipment unless you know you're getting your equipment from your trusted best friend or somebody who is very well respected in the bee community. Used equipment isn't a bad thing necessarily, but you do want to make sure it's pest and disease free. The other thing to consider is the startup cost. One hive alone, which includes the hive plus your veil, smoker, hive tools, and a few of the other essentials, can run about $600 and up. And it's suggested for a new beekeeper that you try to have at least 2 hives so that when you're looking at one and then looking at the other, that you can compare where they're at. And it helps you understand if one hive is starting to fail or not. And that startup fee that I mentioned does not include any of the honey extraction equipment that you would need. Many times, local beekeeping groups, if you're a member, they do have extractors that you can borrow when you need to do that. And again, as I mentioned, make sure that you have time to do this. That's pretty essential. I thought I would have time, and some years I do, and some years I don't. It takes a couple hours a week to really be in there and making sure your hives are properly functioning. So in a honeybee hive, you will find 3 types of individuals. You'll find a female queen, a female worker, and male drones. The queen is the first one that we'll talk about. There's 1 queen per hive, and we can see her located in this picture here off in the middle of the right side. She's the one that doesn't have the black bands on her. The queen will develop from the time the egg is laid to the time that she emerges will be 16 days. During that time, she is fed by the worker bees royal jelly. When she's around 2 weeks old, she will take a mating flight where she'll have successions of mating flights. She will mate with up to about 20 drones. She will come back to the hive where she'll spend the rest of her life, producing eggs anywhere from hopefully 1,000 eggs or more per day. So 1,000 to 1,500 eggs per day is fairly typical for a good laying queen. This amount, though, is based on several factors, which includes her health, the size of the hive, the available food resources at that time of the year, and the age of the queen. A queen can live 2 to 4 years. Many beekeepers will requeen much sooner than that. And the worker bees. These are the females that do all the work in the hive. And they have many, many functions in that hive. So it takes about 21 days for a worker bee to develop and emerge. They do go through complete metamorphosis, and they actually do emerge as a adult looking bee. In the summertime, a worker bee will live about 5 to 7 weeks. And what we say as beekeepers is they literally wear their wings out by flying in and out to get resources for the hive. So what do worker bees do? There are 3 types of worker bees. There's the nurse bees, the house, and the guard bees. And the, or I should just say house or guard bees and foraging bees. Their duties include feeding and attending to the queen, feeding the brood, keeping the eggs at 95 degrees Fahrenheit, cleaning and defending the hive, controlling the temperature in the hive, controlling the humidity and airflow in the hive, regulating the population, and then foraging for food, plant resins, and water collection. What's somewhat unique about a worker bee is she will have a honey stomach where she collects the honey, the nectar as she goes out and then regurgitates that. And then she also has pollen baskets on her legs. The house bees in the hive will communicate to the foraging bees the resources that are needed, whether they be protein, carbohydrates, propolis, or water for the hive. So it's a very complex system. And it's fun to watch them. They will make waggle dances on the entrances of the hives many times that you can watch. So a drone is the bee that's in this picture being ejected from the hive. It's the larger bee that we see there. You can't tell the striping on it the way it's positioned, and it's the one nearest the end of the board there. So the drone are male bees. Drones take 24 days to develop, and they can live 3 to 6 months. One of the reasons they get to live 3 to 6 months is they are non-working. So they're in the hive being attended to, and they're not out performing any of the functions of the duties of the hive or collecting any of the resources. They're a larger size than a honeybee, and they do not have a stinger. And there are about 1,000 drones per hive, and they have one function, and that function is to mate with a queen from another hive. If a drone is successful at mating, they will die after the mating. And in the fall, as we can see in this picture here, the worker bees will eject all of the drones from the hive. So they're not taking up any resources over the wintertime. So with your hive location, again, we need to make sure it's located in full sun. If possible, facing the hive to a south or a southeast location is preferred. And preferably located, as I mentioned before, near nectar, pollen, and water sources. And the water sources you can provide as seen in this picture here. In this picture, we have a pan of water that we've placed some large rocks into, and then making sure that the water is below the rocks. So the bees are going to land on the rocks and then be able to sip the water from the pan. If you're using a bird bath and they're trying to go to the edge of a bird bath, they may slip and kind of fall in and not be able to make their way back out. So the rocks help them have a footing and a way to safely drink the water. If you can avoid placing your hives near open fields, particularly farm fields, and avoid placing them where children would play or pets would frequent. I can tell you a small story here, and that is that my daughter went on vacation last summer and her dog was out in the yard sniffing around. The next morning, we woke up to the face of her dog being completely swollen from bee stings. She was out nosing around in some clover in the yard, and got stung. And yeah, that was fun. She was fine, perfectly fine, but it is possible to get stung. If you do live near farm fields, make sure that you're communicating with the farm owner or whoever might be spraying those fields, and let them know that you do have beehives, and ask that they notify you when they're spraying chemicals. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. Whether you're gardening for honeybees or native bees, there's some general things that we can do to help both of them and help all pollinators in our garden. One of the things that we can do is plant blooming plants in groups or in beds. So not just an individual plant, but rather at least 3 or 5 of a particular plant. That will be a way that they can visit many flowers in one location. If we can plan for a succession of blooms. So this is extremely important. Right now, bees are out and about and foraging, and maple trees are in bloom. They will also take cleansing flights in the winter if they can, but right now, I should rephrase that. They may not be out today, particularly if it's cold, if it's 40 degrees, but they come out on warmer days in the winter. So we can plant for succession of bloom, meaning we have something in bloom from March through October. That is helpful for all types of pollinating insects, or at least know what our neighbors are planting and maybe fill in the gaps on the calendar year. So we can provide a variety of annual and perennial flowers, trees, shrubs, fruits, and vegetables. These can all be visited by our pollinating insects. So again, as I mentioned, some plants will provide pollen, some will provide nectar, and some will provide both. So checking into plant lists to see what might be the most beneficial for our pollinators. And then if possible, limit our pesticide use. So we're going to limit that if we can to times when the pollinators are not active. They are going to be most active during the day. So that's when we want to try to avoid any pesticide use. Read those labels on the pesticides, make sure that they're not toxic to bees. And if you are going to be spraying just a few vegetables, so let's say you're going to be spraying your squash plants for squash bugs, maybe go out and remove any flowers from your squash plants prior to doing so. And again, I said, if you have a few plants, I understand that's not possible if you have a large number, but that may help as well. But anything we can do to limit the exposure to pollinating insects is a good thing. Here I've listed out a few resources for you. Bee Spotter has a nice information on making a bee-friendly garden and contains particular plant listings and if they are a pollen or a nectar source. The Indiana Department of Natural Resources has a gardening for honeybees fact sheet that has several pages of different types of plant material which are beneficial to pollinators. And then the University of Kentucky has a woody ornamentals for bee-friendly landscapes fact sheet as well. Another thing I'd caution on this one is make sure that if you're looking at trees that it's zone hardy for your particular area in Illinois. So I couldn't possibly list all of the nectar sources that are available, but here's just a really small sampling of those. Again, thinking of having succession of blooms all season. In the spring, clover, henbit, honey locust, black locust, blueberries, fruit trees are a great source of nectar. In the summer, we move to pumpkins and squash, mint, oregano, basil, and lavender. Many of your herbs are great for pollinators. And then in the fall, goldenrod, asters, and spiderflower. I will make a note here. So we see lavender in this photo. One of the things that we encourage herb growers to do is to leave their flowers on their plants if they can. So we always tell folks, for culinary purposes, don't let your herbs flower, because the oils are more concentrated in the leaves when they haven't flowered yet. But if you're not wanting to harvest the entire plant for drying purposes, leave part of it, let it flower, and then as those flowers fade, then cut the plant back. We could go into a whole session on that, but if you grow herbs, I think you should know what I'm mentioning there. So those flowers are a good resource for many of our pollinating insects. So for pollen sources, right now, at least in central Illinois, we have hyacinth blooming, maple trees blooming. I haven't checked on holly and apple trees yet, but strawberries may be starting to bloom soon as well. A little bit early, I know, but it's happening this year. In the summer, we have chives, cucumber, melons, buckwheat, sunflowers, and in the fall, cut plant, asters, and goldenrod, which are all native, are good sources of pollen. So in this photo here, we have a basic Langstroth hive. This is the most common hive type, and they have hanging and movable frames inside of each of those boxes. So going from the bottom up, in this particular hive, we have 2 concrete blocks, or you could make a wooden platform, but we do want to get the hive up and off the ground just a little bit. You could make this a little bit higher up as well, but you do need to think about, once you get your hive boxes on there and your supers, you don't want it to be too tall that you can't reach everything. But from the bottom up, again, on this particular one, we have 2 concrete blocks in which the base is setting on. The base is called a bottom board. In this time of year, we may have a entrance reducer, where you see those bees there may be an entrance reducer there, which limits how many bees can be coming and going at one time. On top of the bottom board, we have 2 brood boxes, and each of those brood boxes is filled with 10 frames. On top of the 2 brood boxes, we have a queen excluder, which is optional. Some beekeepers use that and some don't, but that separates your deeper hive bodies from your hive supers. On top of that, there will be at least 1 super once there's a good honey flow and your brood boxes have built out on the bottom 2. And in those, that upper, what we call super, it has 10 frames as well. That's where they'll store their extra honey. On top of that is an inner cover, which you cannot see in this picture. And then on top of that is a telescoping metal cover. And you can see in the picture here, all of those are ratchet strapped together. So ratchet strapping those together, and typically we'll set a brick on top of the straps there so they don't flop around. But that will hold the hive together to hopefully prevent any investigating wildlife from trying to get into the box. Some other tools that you will need as a beginning beekeeper include a veil or a jacket with a veil. The one thing you do not want to do is be stung in the face, so veils are pretty important. That is the one piece of safety equipment you always need to be wearing when working your bees. You may also have a hive tool or a J-hive tool, as that's seen in the bottom photo there, the red tool. That helps you with opening the hive and moving the frames around. In the upper left photo, we have a smoker with a guard on it, so that with a shield on it, so it will be less likely to get burned. Inside of that smoker, we have some type of a fuel. You can purchase fuel sources. You could use cardboard that doesn't have extra glue on it, or remove any tape, anything like that. That could be used as well. On the right picture there is a propane torch, which is helpful for lighting the fuel that you're going to put into the smoker. And then we see a spray bottle there that is used for sugar syrup when we're starting out with a new package. You also see some gloves there. Those are a leather glove that I particularly use. Not all beekeepers will use gloves when they're working their bees, but many will. And then a jar of sugar syrup is not in the picture, but having some type of a mason jar to put sugar water in is also helpful. And as many of the beekeepers say, you'll never have watched the price of sugar so much as to when you are feeding your bees in the winter. So how are we going to, after we've purchased our equipment, how are we going to obtain a bee colony? Many times we're purchasing our bees as 2, 3, or 5 pound packages. Some folks will purchase what we call a nucleus colony, which functions as a colony with a laying queen. Some may consider buying an established hive. However, we do not recommend this for beginning beekeepers. And please note, if you do purchase a nucleus or a established hive, those do need to be inspected by the state apiary inspector and need to be disease-free before they're transported, particularly over county lines. And you could try to capture a swarm. However, the availability of that can be unpredictable as to where a swarm may land and where it may be available. So really encourage new beekeepers to start with a package of bees or a nucleus colony. But you do have options, and it depends on if you have a friend that's a beekeeper and if they can help you out with maybe capturing a swarm as well. So this is a picture of on the top left, that's a pallet of bee packages. We have a local beekeeper here that actually drives up to Wisconsin each spring and fills his van with a couple pallets of bees and brings those back for Central Illinois beekeepers to purchase. And those are 3 pound packages. So we see on the right there, that is what one of those 3 pound packages looks like. It's going to have a can in the middle that's sugar syrup. And then right next to that can, there'll be a little bitty cage that we see there in the bottom left. And that is the queen bee inside of that cage. And she's being tended by worker bees around her. And then the bottom right is a picture of what that can of sugar syrup looks like. So while they're being transported from another state, sometimes from California, sometimes from Georgia to Illinois, they need to have resources to be able to live while they're being transported, and that's through the sugar syrup. This just shows you if you're just getting started with beekeeping, what a spring package installation would look like. On the far left, we have a picture of what a frame looks like, and that's a Plasticell frame. You can also use beeswax frames, and we're spraying that down with sugar syrup, so sugar and water mixture, and that will make the bees a little bit happier and more likely to try to start laying wax on those frames. On the top, going across the top from left to right, there's a bottom board with a hive body on it and frames in there with a couple of the frames removed. Next, we see opening up the package, and then we're going to take the queen out. We're going to place her between 2 frames using a piece of tape to attach that frame on there. There's other ways that you can do it as well, which we won't go into right now, but that's putting her in there where she'll be tended to for a day or so, and then we'll release her after that. If it's warm out, you can try to spray sugar water on the bees and around the bees package to calm them, but do not do that if it's cold out. You'll freeze them. And then you're going to set an empty, what we call hive body on top of those frames. And we're going to shake our bees into there. And then on the bottom right, we see all the bees gathering around where we've taped the queen in. So that would be what that would look like if you're starting with a new package installation. And then we fast forward. This is overwintering bees, and I think it's important to understand over the overwintering of the bees that they do need to have some honey resources available to them if at all possible going into winter. If not, you're going to have to feed them. So a colony generally will need at least 60, 80 pounds of honey or food throughout the winter time for a strong hive. So here we see we have 2 brood boxes. On top of that, we've placed a spacer, which is just a wood frame around that, on top of that, and that's on top of the inner cover. And on top of that, we've placed what we have here are sugar bricks, which is a mixture of water and sugar cooked to a certain point and then laid into pans, and they form sugar bricks. And this is what the bees are feeding on throughout the winter in this particular hive. So the hive doesn't have enough resources. It becomes the beekeeper's job to help them out. And a bee born in the fall will most likely live 4 to 6 months. They most likely will not leave the colony until the spring. Like I said, they will live longer than your ones that are flying during the summer. So parasites and pests, I'm not going to go into this in great detail. I just want you to understand and to know that up until about the 1980s, beekeeping in the United States did not have quite as many problems as we do now. And since then, there have been a lot of introduced pest species and parasites that are affecting our honeybee colonies. So we'll start off with what is known to be the biggest concern for beekeepers, and that's the varroa mite. This is a mite which will attach itself to a bee on the outside of its body, and then it can jump off and lay eggs in the larvae into the brood cells. The mite can kill larvae, or it could reduce its strength, and they weaken the immune system of the honeybees, and they're a vector for many diseases and viruses. So this is one of the biggest pest concerns for most beekeepers. There's also a tracheal mite, which gets into the trachea of the bees. There's a small hive beetle. So in this picture here, we see a hive beetle trap with actually a beetle in it. And if I go out to my hive and only find one beetle in it, that's a pretty good day. And that means my hive is hopefully very healthy and is able to fight them off, and they aren't having a problem with hive beetles. Now, if I go out and find that trap completely solid with black hive beetles, I've got probably a pretty weak hive, or a hive that's not probably going to make it very long. In that trap, we have vegetable in there, and that helps attract the hive beetle into that trap. So that's a way that we can monitor the population of the small hive beetle. Another pest is wax moths, although usually when we see a wax moth, it means that our hive is already weak and suffering failure, and they're coming in to overtake and enjoy the wax. And if you get wax moths, hopefully you're a fisherman and you can enjoy those wax moths to go fishing with, because that's a good use for them. Diseases of brood. I'm not going to talk about this a whole lot, but just know that American foul brood is rare in Illinois. And if you do suspect that in a hive, you need to have the apiary inspector come and inspect it. And if it is American foul brood, the only option you have is destroy the bees and the hive. With European foul brood, this control is not as severe. It typically, if you get it, you would need to cure it by requeening your hive and getting a better nutrition into the hive itself. And then sac brood and chalk brood are diseases that can be cured with nutrition and requeening as well. Requeening, excuse me. And if you feel you have any of these diseases, you should contact your apiary inspector. So as a beekeeper and as a gardener, we may get bee stings. One of the things to note is, just like in the garden, work slow and work carefully, no fast movements. And if it's a nice day outside, generally the bees won't even know that you're there. They won't be bothered by you. It's when you're making fast movements or you're working a hive on a cloudy or a cold day that you're most likely going to get stung by bees. They are defending their hive. They don't want to sting you because that results in death to the bee, but they will in order to defend their hive. If you do get a stinger, you could try to remove that by scraping it with the edge of a credit card, something hard, your hive tool, but do not squeeze the venom sac. That will put more of that into you, and you don't want to do that. And swelling is your body's immune system, so might consider some medications that help with any types of insect stings and swelling. In the state of Illinois, beekeepers are required within 10 days of starting a hive to register their hive with the Illinois Department of Agriculture through the Illinois Bees and Apiaries program. If you go to their website, you can find that form. It is at no charge to the beekeeper, but it is required, and it's required that you register your bees annually. On their website, you'll also find the Illinois Bees and Apiary Acts and rules, and you'll find information about inspections. And typically, at least once, you'll receive a visit from the Illinois, one of the bee inspectors, and they're there just to help you determine the health of your colony. Here are a few web resources. BeeCheck, as I started to mention earlier, is a voluntary apiary registry. This is part of the Illinois Driftwatch system. Here is a location where you as a beekeeper can register that you do have hives and where they're located. And then as an applicator of pesticides, they should review this list before spraying, and you should get a notification if there's any field spraying that will be going on nearby your fields. Listed a couple other resources here so that you can check those out for learning more about beekeeping. As you become a more have bees for a couple of years, you're going to find a lot of these articles to be very interesting in the American Bee Journal and Bee Culture magazines. The Ohio State University does have a bee lab, so they do some bee research, as well as the University of Illinois. There's a U of I pollinatarium, excuse me, as well. And then I just want to end with just some more fun facts. So what's in a pound of honey? A pound of honey results from bees flying an accumulated of about 55,000 miles to bring in nectar to make 1 pound of honey. The bees will visit approximately 2 million flowers to make this pound of honey, and each worker bee in her lifetime will bring in about 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in her lifetime. So next time you look at a drop of honey on your finger, you can appreciate how many bees it took to get that little drop for you. So there's a lot that will go into a bottle of honey, and hopefully you can appreciate that a little bit more next time you purchase one. And I should mention, if at all possible, if you're not a beekeeper or deciding not to get into that, please consider purchasing your honey locally from local growers, local producers, I should say. And there are benefits to that. One is keeping your dollars locally, but also too, there is some research on that local honey is better for our bodies. So please consider doing that. Oops, what did I just do? Sorry about that. If you're looking to view this recording, give us a few weeks to get that up. We have to close caption that in advance. And you'll also find the others of our recordings on our Four Seasons Gardening series on YouTube. And I believe they will be sending out a link later this week or possibly next with a brief survey. You can scan that code now if you would like with your mobile phone, and that will go to a survey about today's presentation. And I enjoyed sharing all of my fun facts about beekeeping, and I hope that some of you will consider beekeeping, and if not, I hope that all of you will consider and appreciate and add to your gardens, to your pollinator spaces, and adding floral sources to your backyards or containers wherever you can.